The executioner's assistant gripped Marie Antoinette's jaw and forced her mouth open. It was October 16th, 1793, approximately 7 in the morning in a cell beneath the conciergerie prison. The assistant was looking for something specific: hidden poison, a razor blade, any means by which the former Queen of France might cheat the crowd of its spectacle. He found nothing except bleeding gums where her teeth had rotted from malnutrition. He found a tongue coated white from chronic dehydration. He found the mouth of a 37-year-old woman who looked 60, whose hair had turned completely white in a single night 3 months earlier, whose body had been destroyed so systematically over the preceding 4 years that the execution scheduled for noon was almost a mercy compared to what had already been done to her. The assistant released her jaw without apology. Marie Antoinette said nothing. She had learned that speaking invited further humiliation. She had learned that silence was the only dignity left to her. She had learned these lessons through 4 years of degradation so comprehensive, so calculated, so deliberately designed to break her spirit before breaking her neck, that the guillotine's blade would be the least of what revolutionary France inflicted upon her. You know how this story ends. The blade falls, the head is raised, the crowd cheers. What you do not know, what has been deliberately obscured by 2 centuries of history that preferred the clean drama of execution to the dirty reality of prolonged torture, is what happened before that blade fell. Not in the hours before, in the years before. The systematic destruction of a human being conducted in plain sight, documented by witnesses, celebrated by crowds, and designed to demonstrate that there was no limit to what could be done to a woman once society decided she deserved it. The execution took approximately 3 seconds. What preceded it took 1,532 days. And every single one of those days contained humiliations that the history books have chosen to forget. Tonight, you will learn what the revolutionary government did to Marie Antoinette's body before they killed it, how they used her own bodily functions as instruments of degradation, how they forced her to bleed through her clothing in front of male guards who were forbidden to look away, how they denied her the basic privacy that even condemned murderers received, how they turned her children into weapons against her, coaching her 8-year-old son to accuse his own mother of violations so horrific that even the bloodthirsty revolutionary tribunal fell silent when the charges were read. You will learn about the libel industry that grew up around her destruction. Thousands of pamphlets describing invented depravities in explicit detail, distributed throughout France, read aloud in taverns, used as evidence in her trial despite being pure fiction. An entire economy built on imagining new ways to violate her in print before the state violated her in person. You will learn about the medical realities that no historian discusses, the hemorrhaging that soaked through her clothes during her final months, the uterine condition that caused her to bleed so heavily that guards complained about the smell, the deliberate denial of basic sanitary supplies that transformed a medical condition into a public humiliation conducted daily, hourly, continuously, for 76 days. You will learn about the Carnation Plot, the failed rescue attempt that gave her captors the excuse they needed to strip away her final protections, how they used that plot to justify 24-hour visual surveillance of her most intimate moments, how 2 guards were stationed inside her cell, not outside, ordered to watch her every second, including when she dressed, when she undressed, when she used the chamber pot, when she bled, when she wept, when she prayed. And you will learn about the trial, the 17-hour judicial theater during which her own son's coached testimony was read into the record. Testimony claiming that she had taught him to perform acts upon himself. Testimony claiming that she had used his body for her own gratification. Testimony so vile that when Marie Antoinette was asked to respond, she turned not to the judges but to the mothers in the gallery and spoke the only words that penetrated the revolutionary hatred. I appeal to all mothers present. You could hear women weeping. You could see jurors look away. And still they convicted her. Still they sentenced her. Still they killed her. because by then, killing her was almost redundant. They had already destroyed everything except the body. Before we descend into this darkness together, if you value content that reveals historical truths that others have chosen to bury, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Comment below, telling me where in the world you are listening from. What happened to Marie Antoinette was not simply execution, it was annihilation, conducted one humiliation at a time over 4 years, documented by witnesses whose accounts have been ignored because they reveal something uncomfortable about revolutionary justice and about what societies are capable of doing to women they have decided to hate. Let us begin not with the prison, not with the trial, but earlier, with the industry of hatred that made everything else possible. Before they imprisoned her body, they colonized her image. The destruction of Marie Antoinette began not in 1789 with the Revolution, but in 1774 with her arrival in France, and it began with very explicit material. The pamphlets started appearing within months of her marriage to the future Louis XVI. Anonymous publications sold under tables in Parisian bookshops, distributed through networks that specialized in illegal literature, consumed by a reading public hungry for scandal about the foreign princess who had been imported from Austria to continue the Bourbon line. The first pamphlets were relatively mild. They accused her of excessive spending on fashion. They mocked her gambling losses. They questioned her intelligence. But as the years passed, and her marriage remained unconsummated due to her husband's physical condition, the pamphlets grew explicit. A publication called The Royal Toy appeared in 1779, claiming to document the Queen's use of devices to satisfy urges that her husband could not address. The publication included detailed illustrations. It named specific ladies in waiting as her partners. It invented a secret lesbian circle operating within Versailles, with the Queen as its insatiable center. The publication sold thousands of copies. It was translated into English, German, and Italian. It established the template that hundreds of subsequent pamphlets would follow. Explicit descriptions of invented acts, presented as factual reporting, consumed as entertainment by readers who understood they were fiction, but repeated them as truth. By 1785, a researcher named Robert Darnton has documented that more than 126 distinct libel pamphlets about Marie Antoinette were circulating in France. They accused her of relations with her brother-in-law, the Comte d'Artois. They accused her of relations with her closest friend, the Duchess de Polignac. They accused her of relations with guards, with servants, with animals, with visiting diplomats, with literally anyone whose proximity to her could fuel imagination. The pamphlet titled The Private Life of Marie Antoinette, published in 1781, ran to more than 200 pages. It provided a comprehensive sexual biography that was entirely fabricated but presented with enough specific detail that readers found it convincing. It named names. It specified dates. It described positions. It created a parallel reality in which the Queen of France spent her every waking hour pursuing degraded pleasure while her people starved. The mob arrived at Versailles on the evening of October 5th, 1789. Approximately 7,000 people, predominantly women from the Paris markets, had marched 12 miles through rain and mud to demand bread from the king. By the time they reached the palace gates, they were soaked, exhausted, and furious. Marie Antoinette was in her private apartments when she heard the first shouts. The noise built over the following hours as the crowd swelled, as torches multiplied in the darkness, as individual voices merged into a collective roar that penetrated even the thick walls of the palace. Let us take the Queen. We will make cockades from her entrails. We will cut off her head. We will tear out her heart. She tried to sleep that night, but could not. The chanting continued past midnight, punctuated by gunshots as Revolutionary Guards fired warning volleys. At approximately 5 a.m. on October 6th, a section of the mob found an unguarded entrance and flooded into the palace itself. The Queen's bodyguards, loyal members of the garde du corps, attempted to hold the corridor leading to her apartments. They were overwhelmed within minutes. A guard named Miomandre de Sainte-Marie was beaten to the floor. His colleague, the Marquis de Vericourt, was stabbed repeatedly and decapitated. His head was mounted on a pike and paraded through the palace halls while the mob searched for their primary target. Marie Antoinette woke to the sound of axes splintering her outer doors. She had seconds to react. Wearing only a nightgown, her feet bare against the cold marble floors, she ran through a private passage connecting her apartments to the king's. She pounded on his door. It was locked from inside. She pounded again and again, screaming for entry, while behind her the mob broke through her final door and flooded into the room she had occupied moments before. They found her bed still warm. They stabbed the mattress with pikes and swords, shredding the silk sheets, destroying the pillows where her head had rested. They were literally minutes, possibly seconds, from capturing her. When they realized she had escaped, they ransacked her apartments, taking jewelry, clothing, personal items, and several pets that they killed and displayed on pikes alongside the severed heads of her guards. The door to the king's apartments finally opened. Marie Antoinette fell inside, hyperventilating, her nightgown soaked with sweat despite the cold. Her children were brought to her. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse, 11 years old, and her son Louis Charles, 4 years old, clung to her while she shook uncontrollably. These were not underground publications read by a handful of deviants. They were mass entertainment. A pamphlet seller named Jean-François Fayel was arrested in 1787 with more than 6,000 copies of anti-Marie Antoinette explicit pamphlets in his warehouse. His customer lists, seized by police, included lawyers, merchants, minor nobility, and parish priests. The audience was everyone. The effect was cumulative and devastating. By the time the revolution began in 1789, Marie Antoinette existed in public imagination primarily as a sexual creature. Every political cartoon depicted her with exaggerated features and degrading poses. Every hostile newspaper referenced her alleged appetites. Every public speaker who wanted to attack the monarchy attacked it through her body, describing that body in terms that would be recognized as harassment if directed at any woman not already marked for destruction. A pamphlet from 1789 titled "The Austrian Woman on the Rampage" included an illustration showing the Queen in compromising positions with multiple partners simultaneously while France burned in the background. The image was reprinted on playing cards, on chamber pots, on handkerchiefs sold at public markets. Her sexualized image became a consumer product, her invented degradation something you could own and display and laugh about with friends. The psychological impact on Marie Antoinette herself can only be imagined. She knew these pamphlets existed. She saw the cartoons. She understood that millions of people had consumed detailed descriptions of her engaging in acts she had never committed with partners she had never touched. She understood that the public believed these descriptions because the public wanted to believe them, because believing them made it easier to hate her, and hating her had become the national pastime. When she finally faced trial in 1793, the prosecutors cited these pamphlets as evidence. They read passages aloud in court. They treated fiction as fact and built a capital case on fantasies created by anonymous authors for profit. The libel campaign had achieved its ultimate purpose. It had transformed a woman into a monster, and monsters deserve whatever is done to them. But the pamphlets were only the beginning. What happened at Versailles in October 1789 demonstrated what the hatred they had cultivated could produce when it took physical form, but safety was temporary. The crowd demanded that the royal family appear on the balcony. The king complied, stepping out to face thousands of people calling for his death. Then the chant changed. The Queen. We want the Queen. We want her alone. The Marquis de Lafayette, commanding the National Guard and attempting to prevent massacre, urged her to appear. She understood what he was asking. She was being commanded to stand alone before people who had just tried to murder her, who were still carrying the heads of her guards on pikes, who had spent years consuming explicit pamphlets about her body, and now wanted to see that body in person. She stepped onto the balcony. The roar that greeted her was inhuman. 7,000 voices screaming their hatred at a woman in a nightgown standing perhaps 30 feet above them. She could see the pikes. She could see the blood. She could smell the mob, thousands of unwashed bodies pressed together, their collective breath rising as steam in the cold morning air. She stood there for approximately 2 minutes. She did not speak. She did not wave. She simply stood, her hands clasped before her chin raised, her face showing nothing that the crowd could interpret as either defiance or submission. Lafayette, recognizing that the moment required some gesture, took her hand and bowed over it, kissing it in a display of chivalry that somehow, miraculously, shifted the crowd's mood. The chanting changed. Long live the Queen. The shift was not affection. It was the temporary satiation of predators who had seen their prey submit. They had wanted her fear, and her appearance had given them something close enough to satisfy for the moment. But the moment did not last. Within hours, the royal family was forced to leave Versailles forever, loaded into carriages, and escorted to Paris by the mob. The journey took approximately 10 hours, because the crowd insisted on walking pace. They surrounded the carriages, pressing against the windows, shouting obscenities, displaying the severed heads of Marie Antoinette's guards, mounted on pikes that they thrust toward the glass so she could see them clearly. Her children were in the carriage with her. Her 4-year-old son watched the severed heads bounce past the window and asked what they were. She had to answer him. She had to explain, in terms a 4-year-old could understand, why people were carrying pieces of other people on sticks. This was October 1789. She would not be executed until October 1793. 4 more years remained. 4 more years of degradation that would make the October days look like courtesy. The royal family was installed in the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Technically still royal, but effectively prisoners. The palace had been unoccupied for over a century. It smelled of mildew and decay. Rats had colonized entire wings. The furniture was broken, the tapestries rotted, the plumbing non-functional. Marie Antoinette's apartments were assigned on the ground floor, with windows facing the public gardens where crowds gathered daily to observe and harass. The windows could not be curtained during daylight hours by order of the National Assembly. The Queen was required to be visible at all times. Privacy, even within her own rooms, was prohibited. Guards were stationed inside her apartments, not just outside. They changed shifts every few hours, ensuring that she was never with the same men long enough to develop any relationship, any routine, any sense of normalcy. She dressed under observation. She ate under observation. She nursed her youngest daughter, Sophie, under observation until the infant died in June 1787 from tuberculosis, possibly contracted from the damp conditions. The gardens outside her window became a daily theater of abuse. Parisians gathered to shout obscenities at her windows. They held up pamphlets depicting her in various acts. They chanted slogans calling for her death, her dismemberment, her violation. This occurred every day for nearly 2 years, every single day. Her menstrual cycles became public knowledge because the guards reported them. Revolutionary newspapers published speculation about whether she was pregnant, who might have impregnated her, what should be done about any child she might produce. Her body's most intimate functions were discussed in print, debated in taverns, joked about in political speeches. She developed anxiety so severe that she could not eat in public. She lost significant weight. Her hair began falling out in clumps. A lady-in-waiting named Madame Campan documented that the Queen's hands shook constantly, that she startled at sudden noises, that she slept only in brief intervals interrupted by nightmares. The revolutionary government conducted regular inspections of her apartments. Soldiers would arrive unannounced, force her to stand aside, and search through her personal belongings while she watched. They read her private letters aloud, mocking the contents. They examined her clothing, commenting on what they found. They confiscated items at random, not because the items were contraband, but because confiscation demonstrated their power. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse, now 12 years old, witnessed all of this. Her son Louis Charles, now 5, understood enough to be frightened constantly. The children slept in their mother's bed because they were afraid to sleep alone, and the guards watched them sleep, watched the queen comfort them after nightmares, watched the family's every vulnerable moment. But the Tuileries period was still imprisonment with some pretense of dignity. What followed the flight to Varennes stripped away even pretense. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family attempted to escape. An elaborate plan had been developed over months involving disguises, coded messages, relays of fresh horses, and a military escort waiting at the border. The family slipped out of the Tuileries through a series of connected apartments, entered a waiting carriage, and fled toward the Austrian Netherlands. They were captured the following day at Varennes, approximately 30 miles from the border in safety. A local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet recognized the king's face from his profile on coins. He organized a blockade. The family was stopped, surrounded, and held until revolutionary forces arrived to escort them back to Paris. The return journey lasted 3 days and was designed as public humiliation. The carriage moved at walking pace through hostile towns where crowds had gathered specifically to abuse the prisoners. The windows were ordered open despite summer heat so that people could see inside, could see the queen's face, could shout directly at her without glass between them. Representatives of the National Assembly rode inside the carriage to prevent any second escape attempt. 2 men named Barnave and Pétion sat across from the royal family for the entire journey. Pétion later wrote a detailed account of the trip, focusing extensively on his observations of Marie Antoinette's body. He described her figure. He described her complexion. He described moments when her dress shifted to reveal portions of her legs. His account reads like the observations of a predator, cataloging prey. At every stop, crowds pressed against the carriage. They spat through the open windows. They threw garbage. They reached inside to touch the prisoners, to grab at their clothing, to pull the queen's hair. The children screamed. Marie Antoinette tried to shield them with her body, while hands grabbed at her from every direction. The journey ended in Paris on June 25th. The carriage entered the city through streets lined with silent crowds. The National Assembly had ordered silence, not out of respect, but as demonstration of power. No one was permitted to cheer or jeer. The population stood mute while the captured family passed, a collective shunning more devastating than any noise could have been. From this point forward, the pretense of royalty ended. The king was suspended from his functions. The queen was officially designated a prisoner. The surveillance that had been oppressive became absolute. And the libel industry entered its most productive phase, publishing detailed accounts of what had supposedly happened during the flight, inventing orgies that had occurred in the carriage, creating elaborate fictions about the queen's activities during the stops along the way. A pamphlet titled "The Royal Orgy at Varennes" appeared within weeks. It claimed that Marie Antoinette had used the journey to satisfy appetites with her guards, with peasants along the route, with multiple partners simultaneously while her children supposedly slept. The pamphlet sold over 20,000 copies. It was read aloud at revolutionary club meetings. It was cited in speeches calling for her death. Pure fiction became evidence, and evidence became justification for what was coming. But before the trial, before the conciergerie, the family faced another prison, a prison where the true destruction of Marie Antoinette as a mother began. On August 10th, 1792, the Tuileries was stormed. The royal family fled to the National Assembly for protection and was promptly imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval fortress in northern Paris that had once belonged to the Knights Templar. The temple was deliberately chosen for its ugliness. A massive stone tower surrounded by high walls, it was dark, cold, and completely isolated from the outside world. The royal family was installed in the smaller tower initially, then moved to the larger tower as security increased. Guards were everywhere. Privacy was nowhere. Marie Antoinette's apartments in the temple consisted of 2 small rooms with minimal furniture. A bed, a table, a few chairs, a screen behind which she was theoretically permitted to dress, though guards often moved it or ignored it entirely. The windows were barred and positioned too high to see outside. The only view was stone walls and armed men. The king was separated from his family during the day, permitted to join them only for meals. Even these meals were observed by guards who stood in the room watching every bite, every word, every interaction. The family could not have a private conversation. They could not express affection without witnesses. They could not grieve together when grief was warranted. And grief came quickly. On September 2nd, 1792, the September massacres began. Revolutionary mobs stormed Paris's prisons and murdered approximately 1,200 prisoners over 5 days. The Queen's closest friend, the Princesse de Lamballe, was among them. Marie Antoinette had known the princess since they were teenagers. They had been inseparable at Versailles. The revolutionary press, of course, had portrayed their friendship as sexual, publishing pamphlets describing invented encounters between them. Now, the princess was dead, murdered by a mob that had tortured her for hours before finally killing her. But simple murder was insufficient. The mob decapitated the princess's body. They mutilated her corpse in ways that witnesses refused to describe fully. Then they mounted her head on a pike and marched to the temple, demanding that the queen be brought to the window to see. Marie Antoinette was not brought to the window. The guards, perhaps finding even their own limits, refused that particular request. But they described to her in detail what was outside. They told her what had been done to her friend's body. They told her that the head was still being paraded through the streets. They told her that the crowds were chanting that she would be next. She fainted. When she regained consciousness, she could still hear the mob outside, still hear them calling for her, still hear them describing what they had done and what they planned to do. The sound continued for hours. The head of her closest friend remained visible to the guards throughout, who provided updates on its condition as the day progressed. This was September 1792. The king would be executed in January 1793. Marie Antoinette would remain in the temple until August 1793. 11 more months in that fortress. 11 more months of daily degradation that escalated continuously. But the worst was yet to come. The worst involved her son. On July 3rd, 1793, at approximately 10 in the evening, officials arrived at Marie Antoinette's cell in the temple. They had orders from the Committee of Public Safety. Her son, Louis Charles, now 8 years old, was to be removed from her custody immediately. The reason given was education. The boy was the theoretical heir to the throne. Revolutionary authorities had decided he needed to be re-educated, transformed from a prince into a citizen. His royal contamination purged through separation from his mother and instruction in Republican values. The real reason was cruelty. The revolutionaries understood that separating a mother from her children was torture more effective than any physical mechanism. They had watched Marie Antoinette endure public humiliation, watched her endure poverty and surveillance and constant degradation. Through all of it, she had maintained composure. Her children were her vulnerability. Her children were the weapon they had not yet fully deployed. When they came for Louis Charles, Marie Antoinette refused to release him. She held him against her body. She begged. For the first time in years of imprisonment, she begged. She offered anything. She offered her own life. She offered to confess to any crime they wished. She offered complete cooperation with any demand. Just not her son. Please, not her son. The officials were unmoved. They had orders. After approximately 90 minutes of pleading, during which she physically blocked them from taking the boy while her daughter watched in horror, they threatened violence. They told her they would kill the boy in front of her if she did not release him voluntarily. They told her they would kill her daughter as well. They told her resistance was pointless and would only make the separation more traumatic for the child. She released him. Louis Charles was screaming as they carried him away. He was screaming for his mother, reaching back toward her, fighting against the men who held him. She could hear his screams echoing through the stone corridors of the temple long after he disappeared from sight. She would hear those screams in her nightmares for the remaining 3 months of her life. The boy was taken to a lower floor of the same tower. He was close enough that she could sometimes hear him crying, close enough that she knew he was suffering, close enough that this proximity was itself a torture, knowing her child was nearby and in distress, and that she could do nothing. His re-education was assigned to a man named Antoine Simon, a shoemaker by trade, chosen specifically for his vulgarity and cruelty. Simon's instructions were to erase everything royal from the boy, to transform him into a sans-culotte, to make him hate his parents and everything they represented. The methods Simon employed were documented in witness accounts. He forced the boy to drink alcohol until he vomited. He made him sing revolutionary songs containing obscenities about his mother. He beat him for any behavior deemed aristocratic. He denied him adequate food, adequate clothing, adequate sleep. He humiliated him constantly, telling him his mother was a whore, his father was a tyrant, and he himself was worthless except as a tool for revolutionary purposes. And then Simon began coaching the boy for a specific purpose. He taught Louis Charles to repeat accusations against his mother. Accusations of a nature so disturbing that even revolutionary prosecutors initially hesitated to use them. The accusations would be deployed at Marie Antoinette's trial. They would be presented as the testimony of her own son. And they would be the moment when even the revolutionary tribunals seemed uncertain whether they had gone too far. But before the trial, Marie Antoinette faced the conciergerie, the prison they called the antechamber, to death. On August 2nd, 1793, at 1 a.m, Marie Antoinette was removed from the temple without warning. She was not told where she was being taken. She was not permitted to say goodbye to her daughter, who remained behind. She was simply seized and transported through dark Paris streets to the conciergerie, a medieval prison attached to the Palais de Justice. Her cell was designated number 280. It measured approximately 11 feet by 8 feet. The walls were stone, perpetually damp, covered with mildew that created a distinctive smell mixing with the stench from the nearby Seine. A single window, barred and positioned high on the wall, admitted minimal light. The floor was stone covered with scattered straw that was rarely changed. The cell contained a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a folding screen. That was all. No decorations, no comforts, no privacy, because 2 guards were stationed inside the cell at all times, ordered to watch her continuously. Not outside the door, inside the room, every moment of every day and night. These guards were specifically selected for their revolutionary credentials and their lack of sympathy. They were rotated frequently to prevent any relationship developing. They were ordered to document everything she did, everything she said, everyone who approached her cell. They watched her sleep, they watched her wake, they watched her eat what little food she was given. They watched her use the chamber pot. The chamber pot situation requires specific discussion because it became a primary instrument of humiliation. Marie Antoinette was permitted a screen for changing clothes and using the chamber pot. But the guards would often move the screen, claiming they needed clearer sightlines. They would position themselves to observe around it. They would comment on what they observed, sometimes shouting their observations to guards in the corridor, transforming her most private functions into public announcements. And Marie Antoinette was hemorrhaging. She had developed severe uterine bleeding, probably from fibroids or possibly early-stage cancer, conditions that had gone untreated through years of imprisonment. The bleeding was heavy and constant. It soaked through her clothing. It soaked through her bedding. It created stains that could not be fully cleaned because she was given minimal supplies for hygiene. The prison provided her 2 chemises, 2 pairs of stockings, 2 handkerchiefs. That was her entire allocation for 76 days, for a woman bleeding heavily. The inadequacy was deliberate. The humiliation was intentional. Guards commented on the smell. They complained about having to observe a woman in her condition. Their complaints were passed up the chain of command and ignored. The bleeding and its visibility were part of the punishment. A young woman named Rosalie Lamorlière was assigned to serve Marie Antoinette in the conciergerie. She was one of the few people permitted to approach the prisoner, bringing meals and providing minimal assistance. Rosalie later documented what she witnessed. The former queen, she wrote, was white as her own linen. Her face was swollen from constant weeping. Her hair, which had been brown and later white, was now falling out in clumps. She could not keep food down. She vomited most of what she ate. She was often too weak to rise from bed. But when she did rise, she would stand perfectly straight, walk slowly, speak softly, and maintain a composure that seemed impossible given what she was enduring. Rosalie also documented the bleeding. She described helping Marie Antoinette change her clothing, finding it soaked through. She described the inadequacy of supplies. She described the guards watching these changes, watching the blood, watching the former queen struggle to maintain dignity while her body failed her in the most visible ways possible. The revolutionary government could have provided medical care. They could have provided adequate hygiene supplies. They could have granted the minimal privacy that any human being requires for bodily functions. They deliberately chose not to. The suffering was the point. The humiliation was the purpose. The slow public destruction of Marie Antoinette's physical dignity was the entertainment. But the conciergerie was merely preparation. The trial was coming, and the trial would deploy the weapon they had been preparing for months. In early September, a minor nobleman named Alexandre de Rougeville managed to enter Marie Antoinette's cell disguised as a National Guard inspector. He dropped a carnation flower on the floor. Hidden inside the flower was a tiny note proposing an escape plan. Marie Antoinette retrieved the note after Rougeville left. She read it. She attempted to respond by pricking letters into a piece of paper with a pin, creating a message visible only when held to light at certain angles. But one of the guards, a man named Gilbert, discovered her working on the message. The carnation plot, as it became known, was pathetically inadequate as an escape plan, but for revolutionary authorities, it was a gift. It provided justification for removing her final protections, for implementing surveillance so total that every aspect of her existence became visible to her captors. Following the plot's discovery, Marie Antoinette was moved to a different cell, smaller and even more exposed. The screen that had provided minimal privacy was removed entirely. She was now required to dress, undress, and perform all bodily functions in full view of guards who were explicitly ordered never to look away. The guards were increased from 2 to 4. They were given permission to search her person at any time for any reason. These searches were conducted multiple times daily. They required her to stand while hands examined her clothing, her hair, her body for hidden messages or weapons. The searches were thorough in ways that exceeded any security justification. Her correspondence was suspended entirely. She could no longer send or receive letters. She was forbidden from speaking to anyone except her guards and the servant Rosalie. She was completely isolated from the outside world, from her daughter still in the temple, from anyone who might offer comfort or hope. The Committee of Public Safety used the Carnation plot to accelerate their plans. A trial date was set. Witnesses were assembled. Evidence was compiled. And the special testimony, the accusations from her own son, was finalized for presentation. The trial began on October 14th, 1793. It was designed not to determine guilt, but to perform it. Marie Antoinette was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal at 8 in the morning on October 14th. She had not slept the night before. She had been permitted no counsel until the previous evening, when 2 lawyers were assigned to her case with approximately 12 hours to prepare. The tribunal chamber was packed with spectators who had waited hours for admission. The seats were filled with revolutionary partisans, with members of political clubs, with curious citizens who wanted to witness history. Among them were women from the Paris markets, women who had marched to Versailles 4 years earlier, women who had been told for years that this Austrian woman was responsible for their suffering. Marie Antoinette wore a simple black dress, the same dress she had worn since her husband's execution 9 months earlier. The dress was visibly worn, stained in places, inadequate for the cold October morning. Her hair, white and thin, was covered by a plain cap. She looked old, ill, fragile. She looked nothing like the queen of the pamphlets, nothing like the monster they had constructed. The president of the tribunal, a man named Armand Marshal Joseph Herman, read the charges: treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, depleting the national treasury, crimes against the French people. Each charge was presented with theatrical gravity, each accusation drawing murmurs and shouts from the audience. Then came the witnesses. 41 witnesses had been assembled, a parade of servants, former courtiers, revolutionary officials, and anonymous informants. Their testimony was a mixture of genuine grievance, political performance, and outright fabrication. A former servant testified that Marie Antoinette had sent millions to her brother, the Austrian emperor. He provided no evidence. He could not specify amounts or dates. He simply stated it as fact, and the tribunal accepted it as fact. A revolutionary official testified that she had encouraged the king to resist the Constitution. His evidence was that she had been present at meetings where the king expressed reluctance. Her presence was her guilt. Her proximity was her crime. An anonymous witness testified that she had orchestrated the massacre of Swiss guards on August 10, 1792. The witness provided no direct evidence, only assertion. The assertion was sufficient. Marie Antoinette was permitted to respond to each witness. Her responses were brief and pointed. She denied sending money to Austria. She denied encouraging resistance to the Constitution. She denied orchestrating any violence. Her denials were calm, her voice steady, her manner suggesting exhaustion rather than defiance. The prosecutor, a man named Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville, performed his role with evident relish. He interrupted her denials. He mocked her answers. He played to the crowd, turning the trial into entertainment where her guilt was the punchline. The first day ended after midnight. Marie Antoinette was returned to her cell. She had been questioned for 17 hours with only brief breaks. She had been permitted no food during the proceedings. She was expected to return in 6 hours for the second day. But the second day would bring something different. The second day would bring the testimony that silenced even the revolutionary crowd. On the morning of October 15th, the trial resumed with the remaining witnesses. Most repeated variations of the previous day's accusations: treasury depletion, foreign conspiracy, aristocratic arrogance. The charges blurred together after hours of repetition. Then the prosecutor introduced the final category of evidence: evidence concerning the widow Capet's moral corruption, evidence that had been obtained from a witness with unique access to the accused, her own son. The testimony had been extracted from Louis Charles over several months of Simon's custody. The boy had been manipulated, coerced, possibly tortured into signing statements that accused his mother of crimes almost too disturbing to articulate. Now, those statements were read into the record. The prosecutor held up the document. He paused for effect, allowing the chamber to quiet. Then he read aloud: The boy testified that his mother had taught him to manipulate himself, that she had encouraged these activities, that she had participated with him, that these acts had occurred repeatedly over an extended period, that his aunt, Madame Elizabeth, had also participated. The chamber fell absolutely silent. Even the revolutionary partisans, even the Tricheteuses who knitted beside the guillotine and cheered at executions, even they stopped what they were doing. Some looked away, some shook their heads. A few women began quietly weeping. The accusation was so extreme, so vile, that it had overreached. By deploying this weapon, the prosecution had revealed itself. The testimony was obviously coerced. The child was obviously being used. The cruelty had become visible even to those who wanted the queen dead. Herman, the tribunal president, asked Marie Antoinette if she wished to respond. For several seconds, she did not speak. Witnesses described her face as transformed, as showing emotion for the first time in days of proceedings. Not fear, not shame. Something closer to utter contempt for those who had done this to her son, who had corrupted a child to wound his mother. Then she stood. She did not address the judges. She did not address the prosecutor. She turned toward the gallery, toward the women in the crowd, and spoke. If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. She paused. I appeal to all mothers here present. The impact was immediate and devastating. Women throughout the chamber began weeping openly. Even some men looked away, unable to meet her eyes. A female spectator cried out that this was too much, that they had gone too far. The room's energy shifted perceptibly. Fouquier Tinville, the prosecutor, recognized that he had lost the moment. He slammed his hand on the table and demanded order. He rushed through the remaining proceedings, cutting short further questioning, moving quickly to concluding statements. The damage was done, but he could still deliver the verdict that had always been predetermined. The tribunal deliberated for approximately 1 hour. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death. Execution by guillotine at noon the following day. Marie Antoinette received the verdict without visible reaction. She was returned to her cell to await the morning. But the trial's final moment belonged to her. In turning to the mothers, in appealing to something human that transcended politics, she had achieved a small, strange victory. She had forced even those who wanted her dead to see for just an instant what they were doing. The victory would not save her. Nothing could save her. But it would be remembered when much else about the trial was forgotten. Marie Antoinette returned to her cell at approximately 4 a.m. on October 16th. She had been awake for more than 20 hours. She had been tried for 17. She had less than 12 hours to live. The cell was unchanged. The guards were present. The surveillance continued, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. Even the guards seemed subdued, unwilling to speak, watching her with an attention that was less hostile than before. She asked Rosalie for paper and pen. The request was granted. She sat at the small table, the only furniture besides her bed, and began to write by candlelight. The letter was addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, still imprisoned in the Temple. It was the only person she had left to address. Her husband was dead. Her children were beyond her reach. Her siblings in Austria were enemies of France. Elizabeth was all that remained. She wrote for approximately 2 hours. The letter covered 8 pages. She wrote about her trial. She wrote about the false accusations. She wrote about her children, begging Elizabeth to care for them if she survived. She wrote about her son. She told Elizabeth not to blame Louis Charles for the testimony. He is only a child, she wrote. He was forced to say what they wanted. I forgive him entirely. I ask you to forgive him as well. He is innocent of what they made him say. She wrote about death. She was not afraid, she claimed. She had made peace with God. She had confessed her sins. She was ready to face judgment, the real judgment, not the parody that had occurred in the tribunal. She wrote about the women who had condemned her. She did not hate them, she claimed. They had been misled. They had been taught to hate a monster that did not exist. She prayed that someday they would understand. The letter's final lines asked Elizabeth to remember her to all those she loved. She signed it at 4:30 in the morning. She dated it precisely. She knew these would be her last written words. The letter never reached Elizabeth. The guards confiscated it. It was filed in revolutionary archives and forgotten. It was not discovered until 1816, more than 20 years after her death. By then, Elizabeth was also dead, executed in 1794. The letter's recipient had preceded its discovery into death. After finishing the letter, Marie Antoinette attempted to sleep. She lay on her bed fully clothed, knowing that the guards were watching, knowing that she would be awakened within hours. She did not actually sleep. She rested with her eyes closed while the candle burned down and dawn approached. At approximately 6 in the morning, the cell door opened. Officials entered. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, was among them. The preparations for her death would now begin. Sanson had executed her husband 9 months earlier. Louis XVI had gone to his death with dignity, wearing fine clothes in a closed carriage, permitted a priest of his choosing for final confession. His wife would receive none of these courtesies. The first instruction was to change her clothes. Her black mourning dress, which she had worn since January, was to be replaced with a simple white chemise. White was the color of penitence. White was the color of the condemned. White was also the color that would show blood most vividly, should any be shed before or during the execution. Marie Antoinette asked for privacy to change. The request was denied. She would change behind the inadequate screen while guards watched, while officials waited, while every moment of her preparation became observed spectacle. She changed slowly. The black dress came off. The white chemise went on. It was coarse linen, nothing like the silks she had worn at Versailles. It hung on her diminished frame. She looked like a ghost, white clothing on white skin with white hair. Next came her hair. The executioner's assistant approached with scissors, dull from previous use. Her hair needed to be cut short, cleared from her neck to ensure the blade's clean passage. She bowed her head without protest. The cutting was brutal and quick. Chunks of white hair fell to the floor, mixing with the straw. The assistant made no effort at aesthetics. He was removing an obstacle, not styling a customer. When he finished, her head was covered with irregular stubble, patches where the scissors had cut close, longer sections where they had missed. She remained silent throughout. She did not flinch when the scissors pulled at tangles. She did not weep as her hair accumulated on the floor. She simply sat, hands folded, waiting for them to finish what they had started years ago. Next came the binding. Her hands were to be tied behind her back. She had not expected this. Her husband's hands had not been bound. She protested briefly, noting the discrepancy. The response was that she was not the king. She was the widow Capet. Different rules applied. The rope bit into her wrists, already raw from months of poor conditions. She made a small sound of pain, immediately suppressed. The guards noticed. She saw them notice. The humiliation was complete. Finally came the most basic human need. She asked to relieve herself before the journey. The request was granted with visible contempt. She was permitted to use the corner of her cell while everyone present stood waiting, not looking away as decency might suggest, but watching as their final demonstration of power over her body. When she finished, she straightened herself as best she could with bound hands. She turned to face the door. She was ready. There was nothing more they could take from her, nothing more they could strip away. Everything had been stripped already. The door opened. The corridor waited. Beyond the corridor waited the cart. Beyond the cart waited the streets of Paris. Beyond the streets waited the guillotine. She walked forward. The conveyance, waiting in the conciergerie courtyard, was not a carriage. It was a tumbril, an open wooden cart used for transporting manure, livestock, and condemned prisoners. Marie Antoinette would ride to her death in a vehicle designed for hauling waste. Her husband had traveled to his execution in a closed carriage, shielded from public view, permitted a degree of dignity even in his final journey. She was granted nothing similar. She was placed in the open cart, fully visible from every angle, displayed to the crowds that lined the route from the conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution. The distance was approximately 1 mile. The journey took over an hour. Revolutionary authorities had planned the route for maximum exposure. The cart would travel through the most populated streets, past the markets, past the cafes, past the locations where crowds could gather in greatest numbers. The execution itself would be witnessed by thousands. The journey to it would be witnessed by tens of thousands more. Marie Antoinette sat on a wooden bench in the cart. Her hands were bound behind her. Her white chemise was already soiled from the prison floor. Her cropped hair stood in irregular patches. Beside her sat a priest, a constitutional priest, loyal to the revolution, whom she had refused to confess to because she did not recognize his authority. He attempted conversation. She ignored him. The cart began moving at approximately 11 in the morning. The crowds were already assembled. The reaction was what the authorities had hoped for: shouts of hatred, chants calling for her death, fists raised, obscene gestures. People pressing against the guards who lined the route, trying to get closer, trying to touch her, trying to throw things. The atmosphere was carnival and execution simultaneously. She sat motionless through all of it. Her face showed nothing. Her posture remained erect, despite the jolting of the cart over cobblestones. She looked straight ahead, not making eye contact with the crowd, not acknowledging their existence except by surviving their attention. At one point, the cart passed an artist perched on a balcony, sketchbook in hand. Jacques-Louis David, the painter of the Revolution, was documenting her final journey. He captured her in a few quick strokes: the rigid posture, the cropped hair, the hollow face, the bound hands. The sketch would become one of the most famous images of the Revolution, the Queen reduced to a crude drawing in her final hour. The cart continued through the Rue Saint-Honoré, past shops that had once supplied her with luxuries, past buildings where she had once been welcomed as honored guest. Everything she passed reminded her of what she had lost, of the distance between the gilded halls of Versailles and this wooden cart hauling her to death. As they approached the Place de la Révolution, the crowd's noise increased to overwhelming volume. Thousands of people had gathered in the square, pressing against barricades, climbing on monuments for better views. The guillotine stood at the center, elevated on a platform so all could see. Its blade glinted in the October Sunday. The cart stopped at the base of the scaffold. Marie Antoinette was helped down, her bound hands making descent awkward. She stumbled slightly on the final step. She had arrived at her death. The scaffold was wooden, approximately 15 feet high, accessible by a steep staircase. The guillotine itself stood at the center, its vertical posts framing a blade that hung suspended above a wooden plank where prisoners were strapped before execution. Marie Antoinette climbed the stairs without assistance. This was difficult with bound hands, requiring careful balance on each step. The crowd watched her ascent, silent now, the shouting having subsided into something more like collective breath-holding. At the top, she crossed the platform toward the guillotine. Her movements were slow but steady. She gave no indication of fear. Witnesses later described her demeanor as serene, as calm, as unnervingly composed for someone seconds from death. Then she stepped on the executioner's foot. It was accidental. She had not seen him in her path. Her shoe caught his, causing him to stumble slightly. She stopped immediately and spoke her final words. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." An apology. Her last words were an apology to the man about to kill her. Not a political statement, not a prayer, not a curse against her enemies, an apology for stepping on someone's foot. The words silenced the crowd entirely. Thousands of people stood mute, processing what they had just heard. The woman they had been taught to hate, the monster of the pamphlets, the Austrian she-wolf of their propaganda, had just apologized for a minor accidental contact, had just demonstrated courtesy toward her executioner, had just displayed more grace in her final seconds than most of them would manage in their entire lives. The assistants positioned her against the guillotine. The wooden plank was tilted forward. Her neck was placed in the groove cut to receive it. A wooden brace locked her head in position. She could see nothing now except the basket, positioned to catch her head. She could feel the October air on her exposed neck. She could hear the crowd, still silent, waiting. The blade fell. The mechanism was designed for speed. Less than 1 second elapsed between release and impact. The blade severed her head cleanly, as it was designed to do. Blood sprayed across the platform. Her body convulsed once and was still. The executioner's assistant lifted her head by its cropped hair and displayed it to the crowd. This was tradition. This was expected. This was the moment when crowds typically cheered. The cheer was muted. Some shouted approval. Some remained silent. Some wept. The reaction was nothing like the bloodthirsty triumph that had greeted other executions. Something about her final moments, the apology, the composure, the simple humanity of a clumsy step and a polite response, had shifted the energy. Her body was loaded into a cart, along with her head. She was transported to the Madeleine Cemetery and buried in an unmarked mass grave. No ceremony, no marker, no acknowledgement that a Queen of France had been deposited in that ground. She was 37 years old. She had been queen for 19 years. She had been a prisoner for 4. She had been systematically destroyed, piece by piece, dignity by dignity, for far longer than that. But the destruction had not worked entirely. Something remained, something that her apology captured and her composure demonstrated, something that would outlast the revolution, outlast her enemies, outlast even the country that had killed her. Marie Antoinette died, not knowing what would become of her children. Her daughter, Marie Therese, remained imprisoned in the Temple. Her son, Louis Charles, remained in Simon's custody, still being forced to repeat accusations against the mother who had just been executed, partly on the basis of those accusations. Marie Therese would survive. She remained imprisoned until 1795, when she was exchanged for French prisoners held by Austria. She would live until 1851, dying at age 72. But she never recovered from what she had witnessed. She never recovered from the separation from her mother, from the sounds of her brother's mistreatment echoing through the temple walls, from the knowledge of what had been done to her family. She would later write memoirs describing her imprisonment. The memoirs are notable for their restraint, for what they do not say about the degradations she witnessed and experienced. The gaps in her narrative speak louder than her words. Louis Charles would not survive. After his mother's execution, his treatment worsened. Simon's supervision ended in January 1794, but the boy's conditions did not improve. He was left largely alone in a dark cell, provided minimal food, denied medical care as his health deteriorated. He developed tuberculosis. He developed scrofula. He developed infections that went untreated. By the spring of 1795, he was dying. Revolutionary authorities finally sent physicians to examine him, but it was far too late. On June 8, 1795, Louis Charles died in the Temple. He was 10 years old. The official cause of death was tuberculosis. The actual cause was prolonged abuse, malnutrition, medical neglect, and the systematic destruction of a child for political purposes. He had been weaponized against his mother, forced to speak words that helped kill her, and then discarded when his usefulness ended. His body was examined by several physicians who documented his condition. Their reports describe a child whose body showed evidence of prolonged suffering, whose organs were damaged by disease that proper care could have prevented, whose death was the final chapter in a family's annihilation. His heart was removed during autopsy and preserved by one of the physicians. It passed through various hands over the following 2 centuries. In 2004, DNA testing confirmed that the preserved heart belonged to Louis Charles. It was finally interred in the royal crypt at Saint-Denis in 2004, 209 years after his death. The boy who had been forced to accuse his mother of crimes against him was finally laid to rest near the mother he had been made to condemn. Marie Antoinette's remains lay in the Madeleine Cemetery for over 20 years. The grave was unmarked. The location was known only to the grave diggers who had buried her and a few officials who had documented the interment. In 1815, after the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, King Louis XVIII ordered a search for the remains of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The king who had been executed in January 1793 and the queen who had followed him in October were somewhere in the cemetery's mass graves. Finding them required excavation of multiple sites. The search team worked through several locations before identifying remains that matched the descriptions. A skeleton believed to be Marie Antoinette was identified partly through fragments of garters that had survived decomposition. The garters were the type she had been known to wear. Other remains were identified as those of Louis XVI based on similar circumstantial evidence. The identifications were accepted despite being based on minimal evidence. The political need to recover the royal remains outweighed scientific certainty. The skeletons were reinterred at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French monarchs, in January 1815. A monument was later erected at the Place de la Concorde, formerly the Place de la Révolution, where the executions had occurred. The guillotine's location is now occupied by the Luxor obelisk, an Egyptian monument gifted to France in 1833. The site where Marie Antoinette died is unmarked. Tourists pass it daily without knowing. The conciergerie still stands. Marie Antoinette's cell has been preserved, though preserved is generous. It was converted into a chapel in the 19th century, then restored to something approximating its prison state for tourists. The original cell was smaller and more squalid than the current presentation suggests. The reality was worse than the memorial allows. The revolutionary government that killed Marie Antoinette did not survive much longer than she did. Robespierre, who had signed her death warrant, was himself executed in July 1794, less than a year after her death. The Reign of Terror consumed its own architects. The revolution devoured its children. Many of those directly responsible for her suffering met similar ends. Fouquier Tinville, the prosecutor who had read her son's accusations into the record, was executed in May 1795. Herman, the tribunal president, was executed alongside him. The machinery of revolutionary justice turned against its operators. Antoine Simon, the shoemaker who had tortured Louis Charles and coached his testimony, was arrested in January 1794 and executed in July of the same year. He went to the guillotine, protesting his loyalty to the revolution, unaware that his death was the revolution's commentary on his methods. The libel industry collapsed with the revolution's end. The publications that had circulated in hundreds of thousands of copies became collectors' curiosities, then historical artifacts, then subjects of academic study. The hatred they had manufactured dissipated when the political conditions that had cultivated it disappeared. Marie Antoinette's reputation underwent rehabilitation almost immediately after her death. The emotional resonance of her final moments, the apology to her executioner, the appeal to mothers at her trial, the composure throughout her destruction, these elements transformed her from villain to martyr in popular memory. Within decades, she was the subject of sympathetic biographies, romantic plays, idealized paintings. The woman who had been accused of every depravity became a symbol of dignity under persecution. The queen, who had been blamed for France's problems, became a victim of France's violence. The transformation was excessive in its own way. The sympathetic accounts erased her political misjudgments, her resistance to reform, her role in decisions that contributed to revolutionary conditions. She became too pure in rehabilitation, just as she had been too corrupt in condemnation. The truth is more complicated. She was neither the monster of the pamphlets nor the saint of the romantic biographies. She was a woman placed in impossible circumstances, destroyed by a system that needed someone to destroy, and capable of extraordinary grace even as that destruction consumed her. What happened to Marie Antoinette was not unique. It was a template, a demonstration of what societies are capable of doing to women they have decided to hate. The defamation campaign that preceded her destruction has been repeated countless times in subsequent centuries. Women in public life continue to face sexualized attacks designed to dehumanize them, to reduce them to bodies, to make them easier to hate by making them easier to imagine in degrading circumstances. The public humiliation she endured, the surveillance, the denial of privacy, the transformation of bodily functions into spectacle. These techniques have been refined and applied to women deemed enemies in countless contexts since. The methods evolve. The purpose remains constant. The weaponization of her children, the coerced testimony, the corruption of a child to wound his mother, this too has been repeated. Authorities have learned that attacking women through their maternal bonds is devastatingly effective. The technique persists because it works. The mob violence, the invasion of her bedroom, the display of murdered friends' remains, the years of threats that preceded the actual execution, these represent another template. Women who transgress, who occupy spaces not designated for them, who become symbols of whatever a society resents, face similar violence in different forms throughout history. And the apology. Her final words were an apology to her executioner for stepping on his foot. That small gesture contains something important about how women are conditioned to respond to their own destruction. Even facing death, even after years of persecution, her instinct was to apologize for causing inconvenience. She was sorry for being in the way of the man about to kill her. The moment is often presented as evidence of her nobility, her grace, her inherent dignity, and it was all of those things. But it was also evidence of what she had been trained to be throughout her life, a woman whose first instinct, even in extremity, was to smooth over discomfort she had caused a man. That training did not fail her. It served her in her final moment, providing a gesture of humanity that resonated with the crowd and echoed through history. But we should notice that even Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, facing execution after years of persecution, apologized to a man for her own existence in his space. The systematic destruction of Marie Antoinette took 4 years. The preparation took 19. The training that produced her final apology took 37. Everything that happened to her was deliberate, calculated, and designed to achieve specific effects. She survived all of it, in a sense. She survived by maintaining composure, by appealing to mothers, by apologizing with grace. She survived by demonstrating that the monster of the pamphlets did not exist, that the woman standing on the scaffold was human in ways her persecutors had tried to deny. She did not survive physically. The blade fell. The head was raised. The body was buried in an unmarked grave. But something survived that the revolution could not kill. Something that made her remembered as a symbol of persecution rather than a deserving target. Something that turned her destruction into an indictment of those who destroyed her. That something was what they tried hardest to eliminate, her humanity. They failed. In the early morning hours of October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette finished writing a letter to her sister-in-law that would not be delivered for 23 years. She wrote about her children, about her faith, about her hope that she would be remembered not as the monster of the pamphlets, but as she truly was. She was a woman who made political mistakes, who resisted reforms that might have prevented revolution, who lived extravagantly while her country struggled, who embodied everything the revolution needed to destroy in order to justify its own violence. She was also a woman who endured 4 years of systematic destruction designed to break her spirit before breaking her neck, who watched her husband executed, who had her children torn from her arms, who faced her own son's coerced accusations in a public trial designed as entertainment, who bled through her clothing in front of guards forbidden to look away, who maintained dignity through degradations specifically designed to make dignity impossible. She was both of these women. The history that treats her as only one or the other is incomplete. The revolutionary government tried to erase her. They denied her a grave marker. They destroyed her letters. They dispersed her remains among anonymous dead. They believed that killing her would kill everything she represented, that the hatred they had manufactured would outlast any memory of the woman herself. They were wrong. 230 years later, her story still resonates. Not because she was perfect, not because she was innocent, but because what was done to her reveals something important about what societies are capable of doing to those they decide to hate, about how dehumanization is manufactured, about how destruction is systematized, about how bodies are used as battlegrounds for political conflicts that have nothing to do with the people inhabiting those bodies. She died, apologizing to her executioner. The apology was gracious and human and impossible to forget. But she should not have had to apologize. She should not have been there at all, standing on that scaffold, wearing that white chemise, her hands bound behind her, her body failing, her children stolen, her life already destroyed by everything that preceded the blade. The blade fell at 12:15 in the afternoon. Her death took 3 seconds. Her destruction had taken years. What they did to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine was worse than you thought, because the guillotine was almost mercy compared to everything else, because the blade was quick and clean and final, because what preceded it was prolonged and deliberate and designed to make death seem like relief. She found that relief on October 16th, 1793. She found it on a wooden scaffold in a public square, surrounded by thousands who had gathered to watch her die, who had been taught for years to hate her, who fell silent when she apologized for stepping on a foot. The silence was the closest thing to justice she received. If you found this account valuable, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know Marie Antoinette's story. Comment below telling me what you think about how history has treated her memory. She was not the monster they created. She was not the saint her defenders imagined. She was a woman who endured destruction that most of us cannot imagine and who maintained something human through all of it. That something is what survives. That something is what her killers could not destroy. That something is what echoes through 230 years to reach us here, now, still asking what kind of society destroys women like this and calls it justice. See you in the next video, where we will continue uncovering the buried truths that reveal what power does when it decides someone deserves to suffer.